Is the recession really over? Americans became more pessimistic about their chances for higher incomes during the Great Recession than at any time in the past 45 years. That pessimism has eased somewhat, but still remains high. The Consumer Confidence Index fell in September, according to preliminary figures released by the Conference Board. That decline was largely because of lower expectations. The Expectations Index is based on 3 questions about what consumers expect to happen over the next 6 months: whether business conditions will improve, whether there will be more or fewer jobs, and whether they expect their own incomes to rise or fall. In September, for the first time since July 2009, there were more negative than positive responses to all those questions. In previous recessions, there has been widespread pessimism about the overall economy, but this recession was the first since the survey began in 1967, when more people expected their own incomes to fall. Before this recession, no survey ever showed as few as 15% of Americans optimistic about their own prospects. But since October 2008, when the financial crisis intensified after the failure of Lehman Brothers, the figure has been below 15%. Similarly, the proportion of pessimists had never been as high as 15% before the financial crisis, but it has been above that figure for the last 2 years. And at the height of the financial crisis in March 2009, less than 8% of Americans expected their incomes to improve, while approximately 24% anticipated a decline. The figures released this week showed about 10% were optimistic about their incomes, while about 16% still expected a fall. The pessimism in 2009 came as unemployment rose above 10% in October, a figure it is still near. But the rate had been higher in 1982, when there was less pessimism. In part, that may reflect the fact that many people who kept their jobs in the recent recession were forced to accept pay cuts, something that had not happened in earlier downturns. The rise in pessimism has also come as major asset categories have performed poorly. The median sales price of existing homes is lower now than it was 5 years ago. Before this recession, home prices always rose at a rate of at least 2.5% a year over 5-year periods. According to data the National Association of Realtors began collecting in 1968. And despite rising 8.8% in September, the Standard & Poor's index of 500 stocks remains below where it was 5 years earlier. There was a similar prolonged period of weak stock prices in the 1970s, but stocks were far less important then to most Americans. In other words, yes, this time it is different. Stocks are more important now because more people see their retirement depending on their own investments. That change came as fewer companies offered defined benefit pension plans, and more people had 401k defined contribution plans, which were often invested in stock mutual funds. By early 2000, as the stock market was peaking, 43% of household financial assets were in stocks, triple the proportion in the mid-1980s. The Federal Reserve estimates that Americans had $43.8 trillion in financial assets at the end of June, 15% below the figure for September 2007, shortly before the recession began. And 1 in 5 American kids was living in poverty in 2009. Across the country, once solidly middle-class families are lining up at food pantries and soup kitchens for groceries or a hot meal. In New York City, a startling indicator of the continuing economic stress is the rise in the number of homes that don't even have kitchens. Election day is approaching, but neither party cares to focus on the nightmare facing millions and millions of Americans who have been laid low by unemployment, home foreclosures, personal bankruptcies, and jobs that offer only part-time work, lousy pay, and absolutely no benefits whatsoever. So how can they say that the recession is over? In an era of extreme economic inequality, which is another way of saying economic unfairness, Wall Street can be on a roll and corporate profits can streak toward the moon, at the same time that ordinary American families are stuck in depression-like conditions with precious little hope of relief. The Democrats are trying to put the best possible face on this terrible economic reality, imploring voters to give them a little credit for preventing matters from becoming much worse. But no matter how valid, that's a tough case to make to families whose properties are being plastered with foreclosure notices, or to the breadwinners whose 99 weeks of unemployment insurance have been exhausted without anything in the way of a decent job materializing, or the former middle managers now working for peanuts at Home Depot or Walmart. But at least the Democrats are still rooted in the real world, at least somewhat. The Republicans, when they aren't behaving as though they've lost their minds completely, are peddling a fantasy that has already damaged the country profoundly. The party's ludicrous pledge to America promises to reduce federal budget deficits while, among other things, making all of the BUSH-era tax cuts permanent and jacking up already insanely high defense costs. The pledge is as dangerous as it is transparent. Economists have calculated that the tax cuts alone will cost nearly $4 trillion over the next decade. So, how is that going to reduce the deficit? These are the very same GOP operatives who have spent years frantically looting the U.S. Treasury on behalf of their corporate masters, and it seems they can't wait to get another crack at it. What is especially weird is that while they are pushing plans guaranteed to increase budget deficits, the GOP is united in opposition to investments in the economy that would put Americans back to work, revitalize sagging industries, and eventually provide the taxes that are crucial to actually getting a handle on deficits. Weirder still is that even Democrats, who should know better, are buying into the self-defeating austerity posture. More than 300 economists, including Robert Reich, the former Labor Secretary, have signed onto a public statement urging policymakers not to undercut any real chance at a recovery by focusing too much or prematurely on deficit reduction. What are needed, they say, instead, are prudent, sensible investments, especially in infrastructure, research and development, and green energy initiatives. But again, these times are different. There's never been times like these before, and there'll never be times like these again. At the end of World War II, the United States was burdened with debt that totaled over 120% of GDP. But somehow we made the investments vital to a new economy: the GI Bill, housing subsidies, the interstate highway system, the conversion of military plants, and the Marshall Plan. We ran annual deficits over most of the next 3 decades, and the debt grew in absolute size. But the economy and the broad middle class grew faster. By 1980, the debt had been reduced to barely 30% of GDP. There is no doubt that the country, starved for revenues and still at war, will have to increase some taxes. Unnecessary spending should be attacked, but the nation is still in the throes of an economic crisis, or the Great Recession. Poverty is growing and the middle class is shrinking, and more than 20 million Americans are out of work or underemployed. Of course, we can pretend that all this is not happening, but there won't be grave consequences as a result. We can cling to the Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush fairy tale that handing over ever more riches to those who are already rich and powerful is the way to revitalize the American dream. Or we can take our cue from the best moments in American history, when the nation rolled up its sleeves and placed the interests of ordinary people at the top of its agenda. Yes, there's much work to be done. And there's something much bigger going on here. These are more signs of the end times transition days, which also, again, is a continuing day-by-day process. In other words, all systems that are not right must change, and they must change for the better, quickly or rapidly. Matthew chapter 5, verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. 4. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. 6. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. 10. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. 11. Blessed are ye, when men shall revile you, and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely, for my sake. 12. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. 13. Ye are the salt of the earth, but the salt has lost its flavor. Wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out, and to be trodden under foot of humans. 14. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. 15. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it gives light unto all that are in the house. 16. Let your light so shine before humans, that they may see your good works, and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And all these are more signs happening in many different ways all around the world daily.